welcome to Holistically Speaking. I'm Morella Devost, your host. Today's show is about emotional freedom technique. This is a show that I have been thinking about doing for some time, and for the past few weeks I kept having lots of different guests to bring to you, and I dedicated this week to do this show because this has been a very powerful technique that I have been using for myself and with my clients for the past probably 6 years. It is extraordinarily powerful, and what I want to give you is a little bit of a taste of how this technique works, what it's all about, share with you some different ways in which you can use it, different conditions and different difficulties that you might be dealing with that EFT can help you with. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of EFT or how it got developed. I'm going to show you what it's like. I'm going to tell you a few different ways in which you can apply it in your life and do a little bit of a demonstration, which might be a little bit funny to watch on TV. But I would invite you to follow along with me just so you get a sense for what this technique is like. So EFT is typically what it's called. You'll hear people talking about EFT or talking about tapping, and essentially it's EFT is short for emotional freedom technique. And it was developed in the 80s by a gentleman named Gary Craig. He has a website that I'll show you at the end of the show. His website is emofree.com. So Gary Craig developed this technique, and what it does is it integrates a variety of techniques or tools or modalities from different schools of thought, different streams, and it brings them all together, and it becomes this really incredible tool for facilitating relief for emotions, especially as how it got developed. And it's almost like an evolution or an offshoot of techniques from psychology like EMDR, eye movement desensitization and repatterning, that you might have seen, where a therapist holds, it might be a pen or their finger, and it has the patient or the individual moving their eyes as they talk about something and following the finger or following the item with their eyes. And that with that technique, what they started to find is that the eye movement, as the individual is talking about something that's typically distressing to them, actually helped them start to desensitize from the troubling emotion. And this was one of the first techniques that showed really incredible results for traumas, and especially post-traumatic stress disorder. And so with EFT, what we find is that there's kind of an integration of a sensory stimulus like the eye movement, and in this case, instead of being eye movement, it is done primarily with tapping. And so you use the fingers of one hand to tap on different points on your body, and as you're tapping, you're saying certain things, certain phrases that help you start to have a different experience of the troubling, difficult, or the discomforting emotion or sensation that you might be having. So you're doing some tapping as you're saying these things, and I'm going to share with you a little bit more detail about what these things are. But the points that you're tapping on are essentially points in your what Chinese medicine would call meridian systems. They're very actively charged meridian points. And so if you've ever had acupuncture or acupressure, you notice that the needles or the pressure is applied on a very specific point on your body, and it's a completely different understanding of the body, of how energy moves through the body, we are electrical beings, if you will, and so Chinese medicine has done a great job of understanding how energy moves through these channels or these lines along the body, and that there are specific points on the body that are more active than others. You might have even seen or heard of a headache remedy where you maybe apply pressure to a point on your hand, and you experience some relief from the headache. That's just a simple example. So the points where you're tapping on your body are these very active points. And so I'll show you a screenshot where you can see the primary points that we use as we do EFT. So if we can pull up that screen for our viewers to see the illustration. There we go. So the first point is the setup point. We actually can't see it on this slide. I'll show you right when we get back. It's the karate chop point. So when we do the setup statement for EFT, we're tapping on the karate chop side of the hand. And then we move through these 8 points that you see illustrated here. The first point is the eyebrow point, right where your eyebrow begins next to the nose of your bridge. The second point is the side of the eye, so you would be tapping on the outside of your eye, right on the orbit of the eye, on the bone. The third point is right under the eyes, also tapping on the orbit of the eye, right under your pupil. The fourth point is under the nose. Between the nose and the upper lip, you would tap with a couple fingers there, and I'm going to show you the tapping in just a moment. The fifth point is on the chin, tapping right on the deepest groove of your chin, and you would tap there also with a couple fingers. Then point number 6 is what we call the collarbone point, and that point is essentially, it starts at your clavicle, about an inch down and an inch in from your sternum. So here when I do tapping, I typically use 4 fingers on the collarbone point, right as you're seeing me right here. The 7th point is right under the arm, underneath the armpit, about 2 or 3 inches down, and you would also tap with 4 fingers there. And the last point is the crown, the top of your head, where you would also tap with 4 fingers. And so we move around all of these 8 points in a sequence as we say certain statements. And so what I want to show you now is how you essentially do the tapping. So it doesn't matter if you're right-handed, left-handed, you only need to use one hand and you only need to tap on one side of your body. So as a right-handed person, I tap with my right hand. And so the first point that I mentioned is the setup point, or when you're doing the setup statement. You're tapping on the karate, what we call the karate chop side of the hand, which is that kind of where you would do the karate chop move on, say, if you're doing a massage on someone. And here I tap with 4 fingers, and you tap with the very, very tips of your fingers. And you just tap gently. It's not a harsh, hard movement. You don't want to bruise yourself. And each point you would tap around 7, 8 times. It doesn't really matter. Typically just long enough to say your statements. Then when we move to what we call the sequence, the 8 points that I showed you, the first point being the eyebrow point, here I tap with 2 fingers. The next point is the outside of the eye, right on the orbit of the eye, 2 fingers. Third point is right under the eye. The next one is right under the nose. The next one is right on the chin, that deepest groove of your chin. Then on the collarbone, I go to 4 fingers. Then under the arm is 4 fingers. And the last point is the top of your head, and I also do 4 fingers. So we're tapping on all these points as we're saying certain statements that are going to help you feel relief from whatever is distressing you. So what is it that we're saying? The first thing is to identify what is the thing that's troubling you. Is it an emotion or is it a physical sensation? Because you can use it for both. So let's say it's an emotion. You're feeling very stressed or anxious, agitated. So you identify the thing that you're feeling. And the closer that you can find a word that, the closer you get to really naming the thing that you're feeling, usually the better it works. So if it's stress, is it stress? Is it anxiety? Or is it panic? Is it agitation? Is it impatience? What is the sensation? What's the feeling that you're having? So you identify your discomforting feeling first. Then you calibrate it on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is almost no feeling whatsoever. The sensation doesn't register almost at all. And 10 is the highest intensity you could have. So if you're feeling really anxious about a deadline or really stressed about work or a project, you would say, okay, I'm feeling stressed, and then you calibrate on a scale of 1 to 10, and you might say, well, you know, it's pretty high up there, maybe it's an 8, it's not quite a 10, but it's pretty intense. So you calibrate. And then you move to the actual tapping. So the first point is that setup point on the karate chop side of the hand. As you're tapping, the setup statement always follows identifying the problem, and you would say, even though I am feeling this stress, or I have this stress. The second part of the setup statement is, I deeply and completely accept myself. So you're always saying, even though I have this blank, this stress in my example just now, I deeply and completely accept myself. And what's happening here is that in that setup statement, you're essentially saying to your subconscious mind and every cell in your body is that even though I have this distressing situation right now, I'm still okay. I still accept my experience. I still accept myself. In fact, when Gary Craig developed the technique, the phrase that he always used was, even though I have this blank, I deeply and completely love and accept myself. And that was always his umbrella statement. And oftentimes when I'm teaching this technique or working with a client, people might say, well, what does me loving and accepting myself have anything to do with the fact that I'm stressed? I'm stressed because I have a deadline or because I have this problem. What it really is about is that profound message to your subconscious mind that even though things could be really, really difficult, I am still okay. And what starts to happen as you're doing your tapping on these points, which I'll remind you, they're very active points. It's almost, I like to say that tapping on these points is like hitting the record button. It's really activating and reaching into your subconscious mind in a way that just talking about it doesn't accomplish. So what you're doing with the statement is you're saying, even though things are really, really difficult, I still am okay. I accept my experience. I love myself. I am okay. And this is what's starting to drop in your subconscious mind as you have this distressing experience. So what starts to happen as this drops into your subconscious mind is that you start to experience an easing around this distress. It's like a part of you says, oh, okay, I can relax a little bit around that stress. Because if you've ever noticed, if you've ever paid attention, when we have a distressing situation, a difficult emotion, or even difficult physical sensation like intense pain or itching, there's a lot of tension around it. There's like gripping and resistance, and you want it to go away, and you want it to be fixed, and you want it to be over now. And all of that tension just, it's almost like clenching it harder. And so your subconscious mind, all of your brain and your cells are holding on to that experience harder. So when you start doing the setup statement that says, even though I have this blank, I am still okay. I deeply and completely accept myself. There's an easing around it and say, where your subconscious mind is saying, oh, okay, maybe I can relax a little bit around this. And as that relaxation starts to take hold, all of a sudden you start to experience a relief from the sensation. So once you do the setup statement saying, even though I have this stress, I deeply and completely accept myself. I sometimes skip the love. I don't say the deeply and completely love and accept myself because oftentimes I'm working with clients who are really wanting to shift their experience with their health or their weight, and they have a really hard time saying, I love myself. And so, we can drop it and say, I deeply and completely accept myself, because that, for a lot of people, feels easier to say. So coming back to the setup statement. You do your setup statement, even though I have this stress, I deeply and completely accept myself. And you say it 3 or 4 times, even though I have this stress, I deeply and completely accept myself. Even though I have this stress, I deeply and completely accept myself. So you say that 3 times. And then you move to the 8-point sequence. When you tap on the 8-point sequence, you're not saying the whole setup statement all over again. What you do is like a summary phrase. And when Gary Craig developed this technique, he never deviated from this, and all he would always say is this stress. So he would do the little summary of the issue I'm working on, this stress, and then tap on the outside of the eye, this stress, under the eye, this stress, under the nose, this stress, on the chin, this stress, on the collarbone, this stress, under the arm, this stress, top of the head, this stress. And move around again 3 times, sometimes longer, but at least 3 times. So you do the setup statement and then you do the sequence, always, always staying on the experience of the problem that you're having. And notice that the language that in which Gary Craig taught us the technique is always somewhat objectifying the experience. It's taking it away from I am stressed or I'm feeling stressed to I have this stress. It's an experience that I have. It's not who I am. It's not all of me. And now I've done my setup statement where I say, even though I have this stress, I'm okay. Now we're tapping on all of these points saying this stress, this stress, this stress. So we're going to do it in a moment, and I'm going to invite you to follow with me. I'm going to give you a little bit of a pause in between my statements to have you say it with me so that you can start to have an experience of what this technique is like and what sort of shift it might have on you. So it'll be a little bit funny if somebody is kind of flipping the channels and stops on channel 15 for a moment and sees me tapping and might wonder what this is about. But you're doing it with me and you'll know what it's about. So let's work with stress. Let's start there, since this is typically a sensation or an emotion, an emotional state that a lot of us can relate to. And you might notice what shift you start to experience in your body as we're doing it. So again, you'll repeat after me, and I'll give you a pause so that you'll hear me say it and then you say it. And by the way, this is exactly how I do it with clients when we're working on something together. I say it, they hear me, and then they repeat it after me. And if you work with any EFT practitioner, this is how typically the technique would work. So since we're working with stress, the first step is to calibrate on a scale of 1 to 10. How stressed are you feeling right now? Maybe you're pretty relaxed, you're at home, you're watching this, and it's not registering too much. Maybe it's a 3 or a 4. You can see what, on a scale of 1 to 10, how is stress registering for you? You got that? I'm feeling pretty relaxed right now. I'm not feeling a ton of stress, but I'll just check in with my body and see how I'm feeling right now. So we'll start tapping on the side of the hand on the karate chop point. We'll start by saying, even though I have this stress, I still accept myself. Even though I have this stress, I deeply and completely accept myself. Even though I have this stress, I deeply and completely accept myself. And now we'll go to the eyebrow point, tapping with 2 fingers. We'll say, this stress. Tapping outside the eye, this stress. Tapping under the eye, this stress. Tapping under the nose, this stress. Tapping on the chin, this stress. Tapping on the collarbone point, this stress. Tapping under the arm, this stress. Tapping on the top of the head, this stress. We'll go around one more time. On the eyebrow point, this stress. Outside the eye, this stress. Under the eye, this stress. Under the nose, this stress. On the chin, this stress. On the collarbone, this stress. Under the arm, this stress. Top of head, this stress. And now take a deep breath. And exhale. And now you check with yourself again. On a scale of 1 to 10, how stressed are you? Has it shifted at all? And what I like to say is this is just information. If it increases, it stays the same, or it goes down, it's just information, and you're starting to check in with yourself. What I'm noticing for myself is there's a little bit of a settling. I do feel a little bit more calm. There's a little bit more quiet. Initially, when people first experience EFT, what they notice is that it does have a calming, relaxing effect. So this is just a taste of how the technique works. I want to show you and tell you a little bit of the different ways in which you can apply it. So if we can show our viewers that next screenshot where there are different ways and different things that you can apply this to. So the first one is emotional distress. You can apply this to stress and anxiety, as I was describing and showing to you just a moment ago. You can also apply it to anger. It is so powerful when you're feeling intense anger. Doing a few minutes of EFT can really bring that anger down. Grief and sadness, these are big, big emotions that we typically tend to push away, and they don't, I find that they get somewhat stored and accumulate, and then all of a sudden something makes you touch them, and the floodgates open, and you're in a pool of grief. So EFT is wonderful for helping you move through the feelings of sadness and grief, and of course any other emotional distress. You can also use it for physical discomfort. It is extraordinary for pain, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about using EFT for pain. But things like rashes and itching and any sort of physical sensation that is uncomfortable to you can be incredibly relieved by doing EFT. And then there's also things like beliefs, limiting beliefs. I was working with a client just today on her statement that she's lazy. She believes that she's lazy, and so we used EFT on her laziness and helping her let go of that belief. Bad behaviors or unhelpful behaviors like hitting the snooze button more than you need, or procrastinating when you would like to be going to the gym, or never taking the trash out when you think would be ideal, or not checking your mail on a timely fashion and not paying your bills. All of these behaviors that you sometimes have a hard time getting out of, EFT is phenomenal for them. Bad habits, EFT can be powerful for smoking cessation, for example, and cigarette cravings or sugar cravings, or eating when you're not hungry. So it also works for cravings. If you're having intense cravings for food, you can use EFT for the craving, and it is powerful how it works. So I want to tell you a little bit more about pain and physical sensations. So when we're looking at pain, pain and physical sensations also tend to have a strong emotional component to them. And one of my first experiences with this actually was my mother. She was my guinea pig a bunch of years ago, where she had a really intense rash on her face and her neck on New Year's Day. We were in Venezuela. We couldn't find any of our family doctors, friends who were doctors, and our only option was to go to the ER, and you typically tend to put that off until you really, really have to. At least this was our case on New Year's Day. So she had this really intense rash, and it was making her miserable. She was itching like crazy. She was also super frustrated and really desperate. We were sitting down at the breakfast table, and she could not stop scratching for 10 seconds put together. She just was in incredible discomfort. And so we didn't have much that we could do in that moment, and I thought, well, EFT is about the only thing that I think might help in this moment. So I asked her on a scale of 1 to 10. I didn't even explain the technique to her. I just started doing it with her, and I said, on a scale of 1 to 10, how intense is the itching? And she said, it's a 12. It is up there. So we started doing the tapping on the itching, following exactly the same formula. Even though I have this itch, I still deeply and completely love and accept myself. And we did the setup statement 3 times. Even though I have this itch, I deeply and completely love and accept myself. And then we did the sequence and tapped on all of the points saying this itch, this itch, this itch, this itch, etc. So when we did that, did a few minutes of the itching, I asked her again. She took a deep breath. I asked her again, on a scale of 1 to 10, how intense is the itch? And it had come down. It was maybe a 7 or an 8, something like that. And I asked her, what is the most salient sensation or feeling that you're having? At that point, what she was feeling most acutely, more than the itch, was this feeling of despair, the feeling that it was never going to go away because it had been getting worse over the course of the last couple of days, and New Year's Day, it was just horrific. And so she was in this immense despair that she had tried all of her remedies and nothing had worked. So we tapped on the despair. We said, even though I have this despair and I am afraid that this rash is never going to go away, I still deeply and completely love and accept myself. And then we tapped on this despair, this despair, this despair, all of that. And so at the end, I asked her, calibrate again. On a scale of 1 to 10, how intense is the despair? It was now pretty much non-existent, 2 or 3, something like that. And I asked her, how intense is the itch? And so now the itch on a scale of 1 to 10 had come down to like a 5. So we hadn't really tapped on the itch this second round. We had tapped on the emotional despair. And so when we continued the tapping, she started realizing that the emotional feeling had been exacerbating the physical sensation. And this is typically what happens with pain, with physical discomfort, is that usually there's a gripping, there's a pushing, or a resistance to the actual physical sensation, and so the emotion worsens it, makes that sensation that much more heightened. So this is how EFT has been extraordinarily powerful in helping people with their pain experience, with rashes, with physical discomfort. And I wanted to share this little tidbit with you of how to use EFT for a variety of discomfort situations, ailments, and emotional distress. I want to show you a couple websites before we're out of time. The original website from Gary Craig is emofree.com, and there's also another great website called thetapping-solution.com. Both of these websites have lots of resources for you to learn more about the technique and use the technique on your own. And if you need support, you can reach out to me. I'd be happy to help you out. It's always helpful to work with a practitioner. You can also research EFT practitioners in your area. Do a Google search, and I'm sure you'll find some people that might be able to help you. Usually at first, it's great to get someone who will guide you through the technique as you get a hang of it. I wanted to just bring you a little taste of what EFT is about so that you could perhaps be piqued in your curiosity, so you can look it up and maybe find some relief for your discomfort and your distress. I hope this was interesting and helpful, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.